Okay, I've got 6 o'clock. Everybody ready?
Ready.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Today's Tuesday, March 15th, 2001. Time's now 6 o'clock. This is a regularly scheduled meeting of the Planning and Zoning Commission. At this time, Myrna, will you please call the roll so we can establish which commissioners are present to vote on items this evening?
Yes. Sherry Heinzman will not be participating this evening. Kayla McCord,
Yes.
Tim Haney,
Yes.
Travis Perthias,
Yes.
Jay Warren, Jim Sawyer,
Yes.
so we're missing Jay, but we should have a quorum without him for the moment.
So we have 4. We have Kayla, Tim, myself, and Jim.
Yes.
Okay. All right. At this time, I would like to remind everyone that the complete agenda for tonight's meeting and all the supporting documents have been posted to the city's website. If you have any questions on locating this information, please reach out to the planning department staff. Tonight's meeting consists of 3 parts: regular agenda, consent agenda, and legislative agenda. Sophia's not here, so Adriana, do you mind walking everyone through how to participate in the meeting this evening?
Sure, not a problem. Absolutely be happy to. Good evening, Commission. For those who do not know me, as I believe we have some of our newer members that are joining in to listen in. Avila, I'm the current planning manager here with the team. And so for tonight's meeting, it is being recorded. It is a virtual meeting. And so we ask first that you please mute your microphones until you are called upon and ready to speak. This way we can avoid any sort of echoing going on, and we're able to hear you clearly. Also, I don't believe we do. We have several members of the public that are present. And so for members of the public that do wish to speak on an item, we ask that you please raise your hand when that item is called upon, so that we know that you would like to speak on that item, as well as you can also write down your name and item letter on the chat box. And then that way we can make sure that we call upon you when the public hearing does open. Also for our PNC Commission, if for whatever reason you happen, especially since we have 4 for the quorum, to make sure that we continue having a quorum throughout the meeting, we do ask that if you happen to lose connection or leave us by whatever chance and have some problem connecting and coming back, to please make sure that you call either Ethan or myself, so that we can make sure that we can pause the meeting and provide you with some assistance in getting back in. We'll go ahead and write down our telephone numbers in the chat box as well, so that you have that information available. And that's it. Share, you're muted. I see your lips moving, but just FYI, you're muted.
Sorry.
Nope.
So our first item is the regular agenda, public wishing to address the board. Persons may add an item to the future board agenda by filing a written request with the staff liaison no later than 1 week prior to the board meeting. The request must include the speaker's name and specific topic to be addressed with sufficient information to inform the board and the public. This time, I don't believe. At this time, no items have been posted to the agenda. No persons have signed up to address the board. So that takes us to the consent agenda portion of our meeting, which includes routine and non-controversial items, along with items that do not require a public hearing. So tonight's consent agenda consists of items B through item BK. And as I understand, Commissioner Haney has filed a conflict of interest form for items E and Q and will be abstaining from voting for those items. So at this time, I ask if there's any commissioners that need to abstain on any other items that we were not previously aware of. Not hearing anyone. Are there any items that the commissioners would like to pull from the consent agenda? I'm not hearing anyone. Are there any items that the public wishes to pull from the consent agenda? Okay. Commissioners, at this time, the floor is open to a motion on the consent agenda.
Chairman, if I may, since there are 2 items on the consent agenda where Mr. Haney has to recuse himself, we wouldn't have a quorum for those 2 specific items. So I think if we can take action on the rest of the consent agenda until Jay Warren is able to join the meeting. And then, because my understanding is that he's driving up right now, and so he should be joining the meeting in about 20 minutes. So maybe we can just take action only on those 2 items and then come back later in the meeting to take action on the 2 remaining consent items so that we ensure that we have a quorum for those 2 items.
Okay, so we could potentially have a motion for or against excluding items E and Q.
Right, so as the chair, we can move those items out of the consent agenda to the regular agenda, right? And move them towards the end of the legislative agenda so that we can take action on them later in the evening. And then just take a motion on all the items of the consent, except for those 2 items. We can go to the legislative regular item since we'll continue to have a quorum for those. And then when Mr. Warren is able to join the meeting and we have a quorum, we can take action on the remaining 2 consent items.
Okay. So the floor is open to a motion.
This is Kayla McCord. Move to accept the consent agenda. Items B through BK as presented, with the exception of items E and Q, which will be moved to the end of the legislative agenda.
Okay. We have a motion by Commissioner McCord. Do we have a second?
This is Jim. I second it.
Second by Commissioner Salyer. Myrna, will you call the roll on that?
Kayla McCord,
Yes.
Travis Perthius,
Yes.
Jim Sawyer,
Yes.
Tim Haney.
Yes.
So motion carries 4 votes in favor, 0 opposed. Okay, so that takes us to the legislative agenda. So the first item there is item BL, which is file number 2020-4-ANX, and this is Ethan's item.
Sure. Let me get situated here. All right, can y'all see my screen? All right, good evening. Are y'all seeing my presentation?
Yes, we can see it.
Wonderful, thank you. Tonight's item will actually look a little bit familiar because this is actually an annexation zoning for a property you've seen before. You've seen this about a year ago. But tonight the applicant is requesting initial zoning for their annexation. And just like with any annexation, we do not consider, the Planning and Zoning Commission only reviews the initial zoning request. So tonight we're not discussing whether or not it's appropriate to annex this property, but we're discussing whether or not the initial zoning designation that's being requested is appropriate. So tonight we're going to be looking at a planned unit development district for a property located on Westinghouse Road. You will recognize this property before because you did see it about a year ago. Last June, in one of the first virtual meetings we had after COVID, the Planning and Zoning Commission recommended approval of the zoning configuration for this property that you see there on your right. So it included just over 4 acres of commercial property at the front of the, and then a high density multifamily and a low density multifamily designation at the rear. Eventually, that request went on from the Planning and Zoning Commission to the City Council, where it was ultimately denied. So after some time exploring how they could address the council's concerns, the applicant has come back and submitted 2 requests to us. So the request for tonight is the planned unit development, which includes some terms for phasing and design that we hope to be able to address the council's concerns with, and a separate application that has worked its way through the Historic and Architectural Review Commission for a historic landmark designation for the historic home on the property. So as we walk through the changes since you've seen this last, just want to remind you of a few bits of context. This property is located on the south side of Westinghouse Road. If you're traveling east on Westinghouse, it will be right after the new gas station tenant spaces, if you've been down there recently. Is surrounded by a lot of names that'll probably be familiar to you from recent development in the future. Directly across the street is the Windmill Hill project. You have some new commercial development there, as well as a multifamily site. Catty corner to the northeast, you have the Terra Vista neighborhood. Moving around clockwise, mansions at Georgetown. To the south, the Vista Point single family neighborhood. And then the Texas DPS office right there, where you would go to renew your driver's license. This property does sit within our regional center that's planned around the intersection of Westinghouse and I-35. So those regional centers are really supposed to be those places where you have predominantly commercial development meant to serve a larger area of the community. These areas are not meant to support uses that would typically only be serve, the neighborhoods they're adjacent to. They're expected to draw visitors from multiple neighborhoods or even across the city. In these regional center areas, our primary target use is going to be commercial development. But we also expect to see some high density residential or even medium to low density residential there to support those commercial centers and to place our areas of our city with the highest density next to the services they'll use. The comprehensive plan also talks about the way that these corridors should be set up. And so in these regional centers, you can expect the most intense, uses that generate the most traffic. You can expect those to be up front along the corridor, and you can expect the less intense uses that don't want to be near the traffic to be placed away from the corridor. So currently the property sits in our ATJ, except for 1 acre around an existing homestead. In 2011, the city completed a city-initiated annexation of the area within the bold black line, and property owners were offered an exemption from this annexation. So the 2 property owners under this request tonight did enter an annexation agreement where the homestead would be annexed and the rest of the property would remain in the ETJ for at least 15 years. Tonight, so since then, the applicant has submitted a request for voluntary annexation. So tonight, this request does include the 1 acre homestead just as a cleanup. Back in 2011, the paperwork for that might not have been as clear as it could have been. And so tonight we are just including that in this request to clean it up. In that regional center, if you looked at the zoning map I just showed you, you'll see that right now we're almost at our split. Our regional center calls for roughly a 25%, so 25%, 75% split between residential and commercial properties. Currently, the regional center sits just over that line. So, and you have about 5.5% of property in that area that is still unentitled. We can talk about the impacts of this request here later. The PUD that's before you tonight is really not very much different than the original zoning request you saw last year that was straight zoning. What the applicant has done here is include some terms that place emphasis and importance on the historic home that's on the property, and include some terms about how this property will work and how they're going to create an integrated commercial and residential development. The primary concern that came out of the council meeting last year was that there's a lot of multifamily development along Westinghouse Road, but we have not yet seen the commercial buildings come up and fill with tenants to serve it. So the Johnson Place PUD attempts to help solve that issue. The pictures you see on the screen are of the historic home that sits on the property, which I have some more information about in just a moment. When you look at the concept plan for this PUD, you'll notice it looks very similar to the original request from 2020. You have a roughly a 4-acre area up at the front that includes the historic house that will be have a local commercial designation. You will also see the area B in the center. It's roughly the same size as it was. It'll include a high density residential designation, and then your area C in the back will carry a low density residential area. And I'll get into the specific standards for each one of those areas in just a moment. One interesting thing to note about this development is that it will include a plan for a driveway that will meet the interesting spacing you get along Westinghouse Road with the hill and accommodate a driveway around the historic home, which is right where the stoplight will be for Blue Ridge Drive in the future. Interesting enough, that stoplight was planned right in front of the home. So with this, the applicant believes that they can keep the home at its location and still make use of the stoplight that's being installed. This historic home was built in roughly 1868 by a family that immigrated from Sweden. The current owner on the property is the 4th generation of the family to own the property. And so you can see that the house has many interesting historic characteristics and architectural features that can be accommodated and adapted and reused in a commercial development. Britton Bostic, our historic planner, gave a wonderful presentation on this home and the family that has loved it for so many years at last week's HARC meeting. So if you're interested in knowing more about the family, I encourage you to watch that meeting online or attend council next week, where she'll be also making presentations of the council there. Area A of the PUD is intended to be that commercial area. So it does include terms that call for the commercial buildings to be similar in design and character to the commercial home and complement it well. And it does include some prohibitions on the typical uses you see prohibited in these areas. Includes the plans for the driveway exhibit, and it also limits the height. Typically, we say the height in the C1 district will be 35 feet, and sometimes, depending on the specifics of the building that's being constructed, that can mean a 2-story building or a 3-story building. But the applicant has asked to specifically limit that to 2 stories to remain similar in scale to the Johnson House. Area B in the PUD is meant to be where the bulk of the development takes place. Pushing the high density residential development here in the center pulls it away from the single family homes in the rear, and allows the developer to build a little bit taller and take advantage of views and proximity views to the south off of Rabbit Hill, and the proximity to the commercial area at the front. The PUD will require pedestrian connections and sidewalks between all of the buildings in area B and C, and all of the buildings in area A. They do ask to modify the permitted use table here slightly to allow a detached multifamily unit, which is what you typically see in a condominium regime, in addition to your attached multifamily units, which would be something more like an apartment or row of townhomes. They do ask to modify the dimensional standards here slightly. Our UDC would typically permit 45 feet. They're asking for just 5 feet more at 50 feet, limited to 4 stories. Area C will have similar standards. And Area C is meant to be a place where that is meant to be a transitional zone between the high density multifamily and the single family homes. So here you will see a height of no more than 30 feet or 2 stories, very similar to the homes that are built there. A 20-foot setback to the residential, and you're more likely to see a townhome style product here than an apartment style product. Computer's slow tonight. You may remember back in June, we did talk about the concern about this being the proximity of this multifamily zoning to the single family development. This is just meant to call out some of those things we just discussed to explain how this accounts for that transition and that buffer. You'll have a landscape buffer, 20-foot setback. Area C limits the height of the buildings down to 30 feet and 2 stories, and also limits mass and scale by regulating density at a lower rate of 14 dwelling units an acre, and limiting length of the walls down to less than the 240 feet that our MF2 area would allow. It is worth noting that a street stub on Wyndham Way was left in the Vista Point subdivision into this property. So the applicant, the developer of this property, will eventually be required to either finish that in a cul-de-sac or to push that through their property into the adjacent property. So they just have to complete it in some way. Probably the largest change between the developer's original vision for this property in 2020 and today is this phasing of uses. Like I mentioned, Planning and Zoning approved this request last year, but the council had the concerns about the amount of commercial area with multifamily at one time. So the concern of the council was that the multifamily would develop, and those residents would, of course, again be left with without any amenities or services within immediate reach of them to serve them. So this developer proposes some terms for phasing of the uses in the PUD. Essentially what this reads is that for every square foot of multifamily or residential space that's provided on the site, you have to provide at least 1 square foot of commercial square footage for it until you reach at least 10,000 square feet of commercial space in Area A. And then at that point, the ratio is gone and you can have more multifamily square footage than you do commercial square footage. This is primarily meant to encourage at least one phase, one site development in Area A for, at the same time that Area B is being developed. So of course we did review this against all of our criteria for a zoning map amendment, and just like last year found that it was generally consistent. We had a complete application, and this zoning change promotes the orderly development of the city. It fills in a gap missing along the Westinghouse corridor, provides for that orderly transition from the road down the hill into the single family neighborhood. We also found that it provides for compatible uses, both with the commercial developments on each side, the multifamily and commercial developments across the street, and the single family neighborhood to the south. And the property is generally suitable for this use. There are no natural features or extreme topography or tree cover that would permit development on this property. The one criteria that, of course, we found partially complied is related to those land use ratios in compliance with the comprehensive plan. These land use ratios are meant to be a guide, and implementation is not, the way they're meant to be implemented is not specified in the comprehensive plan, but they are still meant to be a guide and interpreted as such. So like I mentioned before, currently this future land use area that stretches from Westinghouse Road to the Mansions complex is about just over that 25% residential category. The excuse me, the zoning of this property with the split into 3 areas like we've talked about today would put this slightly over, but not necessarily enough over to cause concern. Back last year, the commission did not see a great concern with this. However, it's still over. It's still putting us on track to exceed our target ratio. Those 5 acres are, excuse me, the remaining, if this property were to be zoned, the remaining piece of unentitled property would be right here on the southeast corner of Mays Street and Westinghouse. We have seen development requests up here on Rapid Hill Road for this piece here that have, of course, recently failed. Then again, we also looked at the criteria for our PUDs. We found that this does provide a variety of housing types in both different, would permit different units in there, and it would bring a different type of unit to this corridor in contrast to single family development to the south. We did find that that arrangement of land uses within the PUD provided that transition we look for between the highway and the single family neighborhood. The applicant did address circulation, both vehicular and pedestrian circulation with the plans for the sidewalks and the driveways. And the focus on the historic home and the intent to reuse the home does provide a cultural aspect to the community that to the development that the entire community can benefit from. Also in this, they did plan to the general building envelopes to take advantage of the natural environment and man-made environment. By planning the driveways around the historic home, they were able to take advantage of that as an architectural feature. And then of course, with the phasing proposed, the features like utilities in the driveways would have to be installed first to support the commercial development and the multifamily development together. We did receive 1 comment in favor from a neighbor and 2 comments opposed from the neighborhood to the south. In general, this is a public hearing, so we do ask that you hold that public hearing to zone 22.27 acres to the planned unit development district with a base zoning of local commercial, high density multifamily, and low density multifamily. The applicant is here if you have any questions or would like to hear about his plans for the property. And I, of course, am here for questions as well.
Okay, thanks, Ethan. Okay, commissioners, do you have any questions for Mr. Harwell?
This is Kayla McCord. I do have a couple of questions. First, Mr. Harwell, the street stub, you indicated that the developers would eventually have to complete that in some way. But I'm assuming that the PUD, as we're looking at it today, does not require them to create any particular deal. In other words, the PUD does not require them to either build it through or close it off as a cul-de-sac. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am. The PUD just leaves that open for the developer's choice.
Okay, which means that there's really no way to know if there's any concerns about traffic routing through the single family neighborhood to the south. Okay. The other question has to do with the acreage allocation. Under the current PUD, there isn't any. I could find absolutely no reference either in the PUD plan itself or in the other reporting that it certainly implies it would be similar. And I'm sure it would be. I can't imagine the arrangement being different. But theoretically, the multifamily area could be expanded if the developer chooses to under this. to all the way down to a single street and lot depth bordering the single family neighborhood. Is that correct?
Not quite. This PUD does not specify a certain amount of acreage that has to be within each area. But if you notice in the concept plan, maybe somewhat small on your screen, it is dimensioned. We do not specify acreage here, just so that once the developer starts actually site planning, if area A needs to be slightly larger or slightly smaller to accommodate parking or some sort of other feature, they can. But we are certainly not looking for these kind of proportions you see that the way the property is divided into thirds to change.
Okay, yeah, I was just kind of curious about that because there's every reason to think it'll be arranged pretty much as shown, but this particular concept plan does not lock them in to any particular dimensions for the various.
It's meant to give them just enough wiggle room to accommodate any kind of issues that may come up when they actually begin site planning and engineering.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, any other questions for staff? Okay, then you said the applicant was present. Or do they have a presentation or are they just available for questions?
I believe he is here. He does not have a presentation ready for you today, but he is here if you have any questions or if you would just like to hear about his intent or vision for the property.
Yes, hello, this is Brad Walters. If you can hear me, I am present and available for questions or happy to go into any detail of interest.
Okay, commissioners, do you have any questions for the applicant? Okay, not hearing any. We can open the public hearing. I don't see that we have anybody signed up to speak on this item.
No, sir. No, I do not see any hands raised or anybody that has indicated in the chat of wanting to speak.
Okay, then we can close public hearing, and the floor is open to a motion.
This is Jay. I move that we approve it as presented by staff.
I'll second that.
Okay, and that was Commissioner Haney's second.
Yes.
Any discussion on this item?
Kayla McCord. Yeah, I went back and tried to look at the council's concerns on this property when it was presented last year. And it seemed to me, based on the minutes, I did not listen to the recording. Based on the minutes, it seemed to me that their primary concerns were because this is not consistent with the regional center future land use designation, and that it tends to throw, albeit in a very small way, the percentages further out of kilter with that. What concerns me is that seemed to be their primary concern. I think it's great that the developer is preserving the home and putting it to good use and making sure it's an enhancement. It's a good project, I think. But at the same time, it concerns me. It seems like we always have this problem with the Westinghouse Road area of target use ratios. So personally, I'm in favor of the project, but I would quite honestly be surprised if the council approves it. That doesn't keep us from going ahead, but I just thought I'd mention that because all their concerns had to do with the allocation. It's primarily a residential project and a pretty dense one at that. So I just thought I'd throw that out.
Okay. I mean, I have similar concerns with that based on looking at how council has decisions some of these items, and I see that they've gone back and made some changes, but it seems largely similar to the original design that brings in lots of multifamily and throws the land use ratios out of see. So, you know, I know that they voted down several multifamily projects recently for similar reasons. So I'm hesitant to support this one, although I agree with you. I think it's probably a good project for that space, but I'm hesitant to support something that I think is just going to get voted down at council.
So this is Jay.
Go ahead.
So, council in its current makeup is very unlikely to pass any high density multifamily. So I would be willing to bet at least a paycheck anyway, that council is going to say no to this. But as I understand it, it meets all the criteria as presented by staff. So I think we've got to just I mean, it meets the criteria. I don't think council is going to pass it. But, you know, staff's presented, hey, this is, you know, for our approval or not approval, it meets everything in the UDC as presented by staff, as staff's elucidated. So I think, you know, personally, I'm going to approve it as presented and kick it up to city council, and then let city council in its current makeup decline it because they don't want multifamily. At least that's my 2 cents.
It does meet all I agree with you. I mean, it from that standpoint, but it goes the wrong way with the target land use ratios.
Mr. Chairman, may I chime in for just a second?
Sure, go ahead.
So it's important to remember that the conditions, the criteria that we review to are just a reflection of the policies of the comp plan and how staff has been directed the city wants to grow. So if you do this, and since this is a PUD, you can recommend conditions with the approval that you want the council to consider. And as with any of your recommendations, you can also forward any kind of feedback or concern that you want the council to be aware of as well with your recommendation.
Okay.
Yeah, and this is Brad Walters. Would this be an okay time to make a comment?
Are you the applicant?
Are we still in public hearing, or have we closed public hearing?
We've closed public hearing, but I believe is Mr. Walters the applicant?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, if you state your name and address, be glad to let you speak.
Okay, Brad Walters, the applicant, 2702 Park Hills Drive. And I guess I just, you know, we've obviously spent a lot of time with looking at this site with staff and trying to figure out what the appropriate way to get annexed and to develop the property. And I share your concerns that the council may believe that they want this whole site to be commercial. I guess the conclusion that we came to after really looking at that is that the challenges with making this a commercial development are that, of course, there's single family in the back, so it's not really compatible there. And then it's a fairly narrow and deep site that sort of slopes down away from Westinghouse Road. And so it's, you know, it would just be an unusual commercial development. And so I guess then the last point is that it is right on the boundary in the comp plan between the regional center and the, you know, the I think it's called mixed use or mixed density residential is the category just to the east. And so I understand that that if this property is allowed to be developed for residential, it will push the ratio up to 28% residential within this sort of regional center rather than the target of 25. But, you know, I don't know how specific that decision was to include this in regional center rather than in mixed density residential. But if we were just in the neighboring comp district, I suppose this issue we wouldn't be pushing that ratio just a little bit above the target. So I just wanted to mention those items.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you for your service.
Okay, does anyone else? I guess we have a motion on the floor. Anyone else have any discussion items? Or would any? Okay, Myrna, we can go ahead and call the roll, I believe.
Kayla McCord,
Yes.
Tim Haney,
Yes.
Travis Berthius,
Yes.
Jim Sawyer,
Yes.
Jay Warren.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so that item carries approval 5-0. So that brings us to, let's see here. Next item is item BM, which is 2020-29-REZ. And this is also, Ethan, is this yours as well? I think that's what I have.
No, this is Ryan Clark's item. Can you hear me? Can anyone hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Whew, okay. I was having computer troubles earlier today. I thought we fixed it, but that's good. All right. Good evening, commissioners. This project is a request for a zoning map amendment to rezone 3.31 acres out of lots 8 and 9 of the Georgetown Technology Park subdivision from the local commercial, industrial, and agricultural zoning districts to the industrial zoning district. For the properties generally located at 4915 South Interstate 35 and 5 Sierra Way. Y'all can see my screen, correct? I think.
Yes.
Thank you, ma'am. So as you can see, this property is located off of Sierra Way Street. This is just north of Westinghouse, right as you get past the car dealerships, right across the Round Rock, Georgetown city border. As you can see surrounding, so one thing of note with this property is that while it's currently zoned C1, industrial and ag, and it's split zoned, it's actually already being used for a general contracting service. As you can kind of see and make out, it's currently being used, I think, as a leasing property for heavy construction manufacturing equipment. Properties around it, again, you might be familiar with from every time you are coming into town from Round Rock and further south on 35 is a manufactured housing sale business. Within Sierra Way Street, others know as a landscaping supply sales, which again, you can see very easily from the interstate. I'm sure many would recognize it from the road. Also knows there's an auto repair and service business located right next to the property. So this property on the future land use map is designated employment center. And what you'll see with the land use ratio is that's looking for a mixture of residential, 20% residential and 80% non-residential mixture. What we used for that employment center area, as you can see, which is pretty broad, we used bounded by the inner loop and 35. We found that most of the area is still undeveloped. This again is all that kind of raw land in between Westinghouse and the inner loop going in between Round Rock and Georgetown. So going into the zoning again, currently most of this property, it's actually 2 lots, is zoned C1, and then there's also this the other lot 9, which is the one that's split between industrial and ag. When the properties were originally annexed, not all of lot 9 was originally annexed, and this wasn't a recorded plat till later on after the annexation. But where that triangle split on the western part, as well as the C1 portion, originally came in as RS, residential single family zoning, and was rezoned in 89 to what we have at 1989 to what we have today, which is local commercial industrial. That other portion of lot 9 was annexed in 2008 and came in with an ag designation. And then we got the full subdivision plat recorded in 1992. Okay, so it was recorded a little earlier on before that portion was annexed. So this employment center, future land use designation, it's meant to be uses that support heightened economic activity. These are heavy uses that hopefully look to have a lot of employees, and the supporting uses to that you'll see are things such as high density residential, mixed use, flexible workspace, retail, commercial. And I think those non-residential secondary uses are really meant to kind of buffer the primary uses, which again, you'll see is advanced manufacturing, life sciences, professional services. It's important, and the future land use guide has also noted that it's important that it serves as transition area between intensely developed industrial uses and residential neighborhoods where appropriate, that there's a use of buffering and or performance-based development standards to protect adjacent uses from adverse impacts. Looking about the zoning map, just a note as part of that for buffering, this is also located in the downtown, or not downtown, this is located in the gateway overlay along Interstate 35 that has that gateway overlay. So there are already standards in place for having buffering along this property, regardless of if the more intense use allowed by industrial. Again, this is a property that's already being used. The current use is that contractor services, limited in general. It's not currently compliant with the C1 and ag zoning designation, so that's what's prompted them to get the zone change. They're trying to bring their use into compliance. They're not necessarily proposing any use or looking to develop it. And because of this, and because of the area that is already around it, between the manufactured housing cells, the auto repair, landscape supply, and what else is along that, we found that it complied with the zoning map amendment complied with 5 out of 5 of our approval criteria denoted in the UDC. So this first approval criteria, we found that the application was complete and it had all the necessary information so that we could make it so that we could perform adequate review and give a recommendation. For the second criteria, we found that the zoning change is consistent with the comprehensive plan. Again, that employment center designation is looking for high density uses that will support a lot of economic activity and employment generating uses. Of note, the industrial district, of course, is our most intense zoning district, but with that, this area is already being used for a lot of industrial uses. As you can see from the zoning map, most of the street is already zoned industrial anyway. So in terms of how the industrial district lines up with the employment center, it would be properly buffered and would properly fit with that in terms of giving those intense uses. Zoning, for the third criteria, the zoning change promotes the health, safety, or general welfare of the city and safe, orderly, and healthful development of the city. Again, this property isn't located, near residential areas anywhere where the highly intense industrial district could conflict. It's along Interstate 35. It's next to other industrial heavy uses. So we find that it sits very well in there, and it's an orderly chain. It's an orderly district for this area. Bring it back to the land use ratios. This won't cause a change. As discussed, I don't know if I discussed it earlier, but again, most of this is currently raw land. There is some residential uses, mostly those ag, large lot, single family houses that have kind of been around for a while. And then raw land beyond that with a lot of the other existing uses of being industrial, including that 21%. So won't change the existing ratio because this property is already being used for an industrial use. It's just to bring the property in compliance. The final two approval criteria: the zoning change is compatible with the present zoning and conforming uses of nearby property and with the character of the neighborhood. Again, this is already kind of a designated industrial area for high intensity uses. And around it, is raw land as well. So, and part of the property is already zoned industrial. So we found that it does comply with that criteria. The final criteria: property we rezoned is suitable for uses permitted by the district that would be applied by the proposed amendment. This is an over 3 acre property. It's suited for the industrial uses. It's already being used for it. So found that it did comply with that criteria. In terms of public notice, there are 8 property owners within the 300-foot buffer. Notice was placed in the Sun News on February 28th. Signs were posted on the property. To date, staff has received 0 comments in favor or opposed. So in summary, this is a public hearing of possible action on a request for a zoning map amendment to rezone 3.31 acres out of lots 8 and 9 of the Georgetown Technology Park subdivision from the local commercial, industrial, and agricultural zoning districts to the industrial zoning district. The property generally located at 4915 South Interstate 35 and 50A. The applicant is not present tonight and therefore can't take questions, but they didn't have any comments that they wanted me to pass on and share.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. Let's see, commissioners, do you have any questions for staff? Okay, not hearing any. Open the public hearing. Don't believe we have anybody signed up to speak on this item. So we can close the public hearing. And at this time, the floor is open to a motion.
I'll motion to approve.
So motion recommend approval, Commissioner Haney. We have a second.
This is Jay. I'll second.
Commissioner Warren, second. Myrna, any discussion on this item? Okay, Myrna, could you please call the roll?
Kayla McCord. Kayla?
Oh, I'm sorry, Myrna. Yes.
Thank you. Tim Haney?
Yes.
Travis Perthius?
Yes.
Jay Warren?
Yes, ma'am.
Jim Sawyer?
Yes.
Okay, that item carries 5-0. Recommendation for approval. Next item BN. This is file number, let's see, 2020-29-REZ. And this is Ethan's, correct? That's what I have.
Yes, sir. Our next item is another request for initial zoning with an annexation, but this time on the opposite side of town, out on Highway 29. The subject property is about 57 acres in size, and the zoning they're requesting upon annexation is residential single family RS. So the subject property is located just to the east of the Water Oak neighborhood, kind of sandwiched between the Shadow Canyon neighborhood, which is being advertised as Riverview. Most recently in this area, we have seen the Preserve at Water Oak PUD, a commercial PUD that also came before the commission this time last summer, and they are working through permitting. Around the area, you'll of course know the Water Oak neighborhood, which has been least partially developed for some time. You'll know the Zoot offices, excuse me, the Zoot vet clinic and dog boarding place. You'll know the construction offices and the little food truck park that's up there along the highway. And then the rest of the property is really surrounded by single family neighborhoods, predominantly master planned single family neighborhoods. So you have the Shadow Canyon area, which has both single family homes, multifamily and commercial components. And then down to the south, you have the Parkside on the River development, which is just kind of the new Water Oak South, which has mostly single family development here adjacent to the subject property, but down along Lander Road has multifamily and commercial components. And then if you were to look further east, further west, you'd see the Crescent Bluff subdivision, which is also a master plan community with both single family, multifamily, and commercial components. Everything here between the highway and the San Gabriel River really sits in our mixed and C neighborhood category. And when we talk about grouping our future land use areas together, we look for natural features such as the river, and man-made features such as roads and jurisdictional boundaries to really define what that area is for the purpose of calculating those land use ratios. So and looking at everything west of Highway 29, we really see that the area west of the future Southwest bypass, if you were coming up the bypass and going straight instead of making a 90-degree turn, that's the kind of the boundary I'm thinking of. On one end, on the other end, we're using our city limits boundary with Cole Estates, because that is kind of the last end of the row for Georgetown's jurisdiction on the west. And then we're using the river on the south as a natural barrier. And then on the north side of this future land use area, we're using Highway 29. We're using Highway 29 here and not taking it across the highway primarily because we do not see the same development patterns and trends on the north side of the highway right now that we are seeing on the south side of the highway. North side of the highway lacks wastewater, and so whatever you see up there is predominantly going to be large lot, single family development until there is connectivity made through there with some master plan nodes and utilities. So if we look at this kind of chunk of it here, we find that there is somewhat similar to our last situation. We're currently at our kind of recommended ratio of residential development here. The 4.7% of commercial development that you'll see here is just those commercial pieces that are located at the front of those master plan communities. And these are not typically large pieces because they're expected to host a corner store or some other business that would serve folks out here. So they have to drive all the way down to Wolf Ranch. The large commercial site we've seen here lately is that Water Oak PUD, which is, Preserve at Water Oak PUD, which is about 22 acres of retail and office, primarily retail and office space. If I go back to that future land use map, what I've indicated on here with black arrows are future connections to help you kind of envision how this area is meant to build out. So along Parkside Parkway, that longer black arrow there on the left, we'll see future bridge connection. Parkside Parkway will be a major arterial road that runs from Leander Road up to Highway 29 and then on connecting to DB Woods. The subject property will ultimately have future connections to a street stub being left at the south end of the Water Oak neighborhood adjacent to the river. And they have planned connections to Highway 29, meeting spacing requirements, as well as to the future major collector that will come out of the Shadow Canyon neighborhood, a street called Whisper Creek. And that will be a signalized intersection on Highway 29. This mixed and C neighborhood really focuses on providing a place for different types of residential. So it's expected to be predominantly single family homes, but there may be situations in these neighborhoods where located along major collectors or adjacent to commercial development where transitional uses like a townhome or duplex complex a townhome or duplex complex may be appropriate. It's not to say that within this whole mixed density area, those uses are appropriate, but there are key locations where we can increase the variety of housing provided in these neighborhoods. Similar to the previous request we heard earlier, this is located along the corridor. So the subject property is not really located at the intersection of two major roads. And so we're really looking at that gradient of uses from the highway down the hill to the river. Our comprehensive plan also calls for Highway 29 to be designated an urban corridor. So these are really meant to, similar to our scenic natural corridor we have now, they're meant to be places where you have a unified vision down the corridor, accomplished primarily through landscaping. But where our comprehensive plan proposes the urban corridor are these parts of town, you can see them called out on the map, that have probably developed many years ago, or developed rapidly around what were probably once smaller roads, but have since grown into major thoroughfares through developed areas in the city. When we look at the properties adjacent to the subject property, what you primarily see is what is called for in that moderate density residential category, and that the direction we're given on transition of uses and corridors. So if we take the Shadow Canyon development, for example, we see that along the highway, they have designated their commercial sites and their low-density multifamily sites to transition down into single family from there to the river. Here on the south side of the highway, development has primarily occurred in long, narrow tracts that have either developed as long, narrow tracts like the subject property or Cole Estates on the far left, or have been lumped together like has been done with the Crescent Bluff and Water Oak subdivisions. The Crescent Bluff and Water Oak subdivisions I've highlighted in a blue color, gray blue color, and an orange color because they are outside the city limits. They have a development agreement with the city, but they do follow the same residential single family standards that the Shadow Canyon and the Cole Estates neighborhood do, as well as the subject property would if the zoning is approved. I've called out the portions of this, the pieces of this future land use area that are unentitled, because you'll see that they're primarily long, narrow pieces up along the highway that are more suited for commercial uses rather than single family uses in the future. And the subject property even wraps around several of them. The remainder of the unentitled property is directly to the east of the subject property. So there is about there's about 105 acre tract there that has not yet been developed, and about a 40 acre tract there that has not yet been developed. We have had some development requests on these properties, and one of them would provide the extension of Whisper Creek up to the highway and the signal. However, we're still working through some technical issues before we're ready to bring those to the commission for review. So today, consistent with that mixed density neighborhood designation, the applicant is requesting that residential single family zoning. The zoning allows a variety, well, two different types of single family uses: attached single family, like a duplex with a lot line down the middle, and your traditional single family detached. This is the same kind of standard that the Water Oak subdivision is held to next door. What's interesting is that you'll see the Water Oak subdivision actually has built in a 50-foot buffer for their residents on their side of the property line. So this subdivision would not necessarily directly share or back up, homes will not back up directly to the Water Oak neighborhood. In reviewing this request, we generally found that it complied with all of the criteria. We had, of course, had a complete application. We found that based on the configuration of the subject property, it's suitable for primarily single-family development. Looking at the topography, the lack of direct frontage on the Highway 29, the lack of direct frontage on the future major arterial road out of Shadow Canyon, it's definitely suitable for single-family development under our guidelines for mixed-density neighborhood. And we found that this promoted safe and orderly development by filling in a space on the future land use map where we have leapfrogged. We found, of course, that's compatible with the adjacent uses on either side of it and across the river, also being single-family neighborhoods. And we found that the property is suitable for this use. The property will be subject to our tree preservation ordinance. The applicant has not expressed any issue with that, knowing the trees they have on the property. And it will also be providing a portion of our regional trail on the San Gabriel River, which is also interesting. One interesting thing to point out, though, is those future land use ratios I mentioned earlier. If this rezoning is approved, it would put us slightly above our target ratio. However, like I mentioned before, there really is not much other development here in this, say for those 140 acres to the west, that could be suitable for residential development just based on the configuration of the adjacent properties, and knowing the topography restraints, and now knowing what is on either side of those 140 acres being a single family development. And it's also worth noting that, of course, this doesn't include properties on the north side of the highway. While the north side of the highway is not developed yet, it could, of course, be developed now. Taking this long linear piece of future land use map area and studying it as a corridor is different than if there would be development on the north side of the highway, where you could break it up more into chunks with transitions going north-south. Roadways crossing north-south to carry traffic that way, instead of all of the traffic moving east to west all the time. So we did notice 55 property owners and received 4 comments back. In general, the 2 comments in favor were found that the single family use was appropriate, and they were comments out of the Water Oak neighborhood, but expressed big concerns about traffic on Highway 29, the haphazard development patterns on Highway 29 over the past 15 to 20 years, as well as the desire to see hill country views preserved and the property not developed. We are considering an annexation, initial zoning for a property upon annexation. The property is 56.6 acres in size, and the initial zoning being requested is residential single family. I, of course, am available for questions, as well as the applicant.
Okay, thanks, Ethan. Do any commissioners have questions for staff? I have a question. Can you go back to the map where you bring in, where you encompass the the area that you're looking at for the target use ratios?
This one? Would you like the zoning map?
No, there was you had another one up there. Let's see. This one. So how far west does this go? Because I know there's some concern about target use, and we talked about that in the other item, and residential versus commercial. So does this take into account the intersection at 29 and Ronald Reagan?
So this does not. So I'm actually going to switch on the map here. The subject property is about just under 5 miles from the intersection of 29 and Ronald Reagan. It's just slightly closer to the intersection with 35.
Correct. Okay. Both of which are slated to have commercial development here pretty quick. Okay. That answers my question. And is the applicant here? Would the applicant like to speak? Do they have a presentation?
Sir, applicant is Madison Inselman. I don't believe she has a presentation, but she'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Commissioners, do you have any questions for the applicant? Okay, not hearing any. Do we have anyone signed up to speak on this item? Let's see.
No, sir, I do not see any hands that have been raised, excuse me, or anybody that has indicated in the chat.
Okay. See. Okay, at this time, we can close the public hearing. I guess we can open the public hearing if I didn't say that. We don't have anyone signed up to speak, so we can close the public hearing and we can entertain a motion.
Jay, I move that we approve as presented by staff.
So we have a recommendation for approval. Commissioner Warren.
This is Jim. I'll second it.
Sorry.
This is Jim Sawyer.
Got it. Second. Any discussion on this item? Okay, Myrna, will you please call the roll?
Kayla McCord,
Yes,
Tim Haney,
Yes.
Travis Berthius,
Yes.
Jay Warren,
Yes, ma'am.
Jim Sawyer.
Yes.
Okay, that item carries the recommendation for approval 5-0. So now we're going back to items, is it item E and item Q?
Yes.
So, Adrian, do we have to, those are now off the consent, so we have to have a presentation and public hearing on those items?
There is not a required public hearing on those specific items, but we can certainly introduce both items to you, particularly since they're both related to the same property and overall project. And
I
at
mean,
least present the item, and then you can go ahead and ask any questions or go ahead and deliberate and take action.
okay,
And I believe Ethan, as the case manager, will introduce the item.
Yes. So the first thing I can discuss is item E, which is related to item Q. Item E is a preliminary plat for a project known as the Canyons at HCH Ranch. And item Q is the associated subdivision construction plans for that application. This project is roughly 180 units, 180 lots. You can expect it to be a large lot, estate style subdivision off FM 3405 at the far north end of the lake. Reasons for disapproval tonight are one, a pending development agreement, which will modify some standards that will allow staff to approve it, as well as some engineering comments on drainage and utilities on the construction plans. The development agreement is being considered by council. It's been approved on first reading. It has not been approved on second reading yet. But it includes deviations from such things as public streets. Streets in this development will be private. Maximum block length. Maximum block length and stopping distance. And really just some things to allow the developer to work on around some extreme topography there at the north end of the lake. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you'll have about this. If not, it's a relatively straightforward project. Oh, thank you. I did not realize I was not showing my screen until then.
thanks, Ethan. So can we vote on both of these items at the same time? We can vote on them separately.
As they have been pulled to the legislative agenda, I would ask that you vote on them separately, please.
Okay. What? Okay, the floor is open to a motion on item E.
This is Jay. I approve as presented by staff for item E. I think Travis has lost his connectivity. You guys hear me okay? Yeah, okay. Travis has lost his connectivity. Do I hear a second?
This is Kayla McCord. Assuming your motion to approve incorporates the conditions set forth in the agenda, I second that motion.
Okay, so we have a motion by Commissioner Warren, second by Commissioner McCord. Myrna, or any discussion on this item? Okay, Myrna, will you call the roll?
Kayla McCord,
Yes,
Travis Perthius,
Yes.
Jay Warren,
Yes, ma'am.
Jim Sawyer.
Yes.
Okay, that item carries 4-0. Approved with conditions. So, and the floor is open now to a motion on item Q.
It's Jay. I move that we approve item Q as presented by staff.
Let me make sure we're clear here. So the recommendation by staff is for disapproval. So you're recommending approval? Or you
Recommending staff's recommendation. I move that we follow staff's recommendation of disapproval.
Okay. Recommendation for disapproval of item Q, Commissioner Warren. Second,
Kayla McCord, I'll second.
okay, Commissioner McCord. Any discussion on this item? Okay, Myrna, will you please call the roll?
Kayla McCord,
Yes,
Travis Perthius,
Yes.
Jay Warren,
Yes, ma'am.
Jim Sawyer.
Yes.
Okay. 4-0. So back on track here. The last item we have is item BO, which is update from other boards and commissions. Do we have any of those this evening?
Just a very quick update on the UDC Advisory Committee. At their last meeting, they made a recommendation to move forward with the red lines that staff has been drafting and working with the committee so far on the tree preservation amendments related to the tree preservation and landscape standards. So we will be coming to you in the future with asking for you to also take action and make a recommendation to City Council on those amendments. And then the only other update that I have for the commission, at the last meeting, we had asked you and let you know about potentially doing a training workshop with all of our planning and zoning commission, both existing and new members. However, because the training by the city secretary's office was also scheduled for this evening, we decided to reschedule that for the first meeting in April. So you may be on the lookout for an email from us asking, inquiring about availability and time to see if we can do some sort of a workshop, either like at 5 o'clock or 5:30, where we have the ability to really sit together and just go over some roles and types of applications that we see for in this commission. And that's it.
Okay, so our next scheduled meeting is April 6th, 6 o'clock. Unless we have training before that, then commissioners will need to be on before that. Because that would be the first meeting in April, correct? Yeah. Okay, at this time, do we have a motion to adjourn?
This is Jay, and I'll motion to adjourn.
Commissioner Warren, motion to adjourn. We have a second.
Kayla McCord, second.
Commissioner McCord, second. Myrna, will you please call the roll?
Kayla McCord,
Yes.
Tim Haney,
Yes.
Travis Perthius,
Yes.
Jay Warren,
Yes, ma'am.
Jim Sawyer.
Yes.
Okay, motion carries. So it is 7:20 and we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
Thank you all.
Travis.
Have a wonderful night.
Thank you, Andrena.